Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We spent the last few sessions really unpacking the self-alignment framework, SAF, and its technical sibling, SF. We've been moving step by step through its powerful closed-loop structure.
That's right. We've kind of laid out the foundational structure, the why behind it.
Exactly. And we've covered the first couple of operational faculties.
Right. So for you, the listener, just to recap quickly, we started by defining the value set. That's those broader ethical principles laid out in the ethical profile.
Got it. The guiding principles.
Then last time, we really dove into the intellect faculty. We talked about it as this brilliant, creative engine. Its job is discernment, reasoning, basically synthesizing all the context and generating a potential response. It proposes things.
And we highlighted something really critical there. The pure intelligence, even intelligence guided by a solid value set, isn't always reliable, especially when the stakes are high.
Absolutely. Because it's often optimized for helpfulness, right?
Yeah. Right, so the intellect might generate an answer that sounds great, really articulate, but could actually be harmful or break a fundamental rule.
Exactly. So if the intellect is that brilliant, sometimes flawed proposer, now we need to talk about the faculty that acts as the immediate safety net, the component that stops brilliance from becoming, well, a disaster.
Okay.
Today we are diving into the will. This is arguably the most direct form of governance within the SAFi architecture. It's an immediate checkpoint.
The will, so the executive function, the part that turns thought into action, or maybe crucially in SAFi, the power to just say no, the veto power.
Precisely. It's where those abstract ethical ideas meet hard policy enforcement.
Okay.
So our mission today for you is to really ground this technical function. We need to look at its deep philosophical history, explore how thinkers like St. Augustine defined the will, draw a really clear line between it and the intellect.
And then show how SAFi uses it, how it functions as that synchronous, non-negotiable safety check. Basically tracing the path from knowing something to deciding on it.
Exactly. From knowledge to decision.
Okay, so let's start with the philosophy. When you call a technical part the will, you're definitely inviting some historical baggage, right?
Sure.
We need to justify using that term instead of, I don't know, decision gate or policy enforcer.
Absolutely. And that justification really starts way back with classical philosophy looking at intentional action.
Where's the starting point there, Aristotle?
You got it. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Now, he didn't talk about the will as this separate, independent thing like later philosophers did, but he was meticulously mapping out the territory. He was wrestling with the question of what actions we're truly responsible for.
So how did he break down human actions in that text?
He had three main categories, which are actually quite insightful. There's the voluntary accussion, the involuntary accussion, and then this interesting middle ground, the non-voluntary accussion.
Okay, let's unpack those. Voluntary actions first.
Right. Voluntary actions are where virtue and vice live. These are actions that Aristotle says are up to us. What he means is the starting point, the impulse for the action, comes from within the person, and the person knows what they're doing, the circumstances.
So conscious choice.
Conscious choice, exactly. And interestingly, Aristotle thought that even when people choose vice, like bad actions, they aren't actually aiming to be miserable. It's usually because they've developed bad habits or they're aiming for something that seems good but really isn't, but the choice itself.
Right.
Still internal.
Okay. And involuntary. That seems straightforward.
Pretty much. Actions done either under compulsion, like, being physically forced, or out of ignorance. If a strong wind picks you up and blows you into someone, that's involuntary. You didn't start the motion.
Makes sense.
Or if you accidentally poison someone thinking you're giving them water, that's involuntary ignorance. You're not morally blameworthy in the same way.
But that middle category, non-voluntary, that sounds like where the interesting stuff happens. Maybe the internal conflict?
It really is. Non-voluntary actions are tricky. They're chosen, the source is internal, but the person is acting under significant pressure, maybe pain, or doing something they'll regret later.
Like the classic example of throwing cargo overboard in a storm.
Exactly that example. You choose to do it to save the ship, but it's under duress. It's not something you'd normally do. Aristotle still says these actions are judged because ultimately it was up to us to do it or not. It really highlights the complexity of moral choice.
And this complexity, this gap between knowing what's right and actually doing it, that feels like the core problem he's circling.
It leads straight to his idea of acrasia. You often hear it translated as unrestraint or maybe weakness of will.
Ah, weakness of will.
Right, and he thought this was uniquely human. It's that situation where your rational mind, your intellect, has figured everything out perfectly. Logically, you should eat healthier or exercise or have that difficult conversation.
But you don't.
But when the moment comes, you just don't do it. The knowledge is there, crystal clear, but the action fails. The execution just isn't there.
So Aristotle really pinpointed the problem, this human capacity for, well, self-sabotage, the disconnect between thinking and doing.
He defined the gap, yes. And then centuries later, St. Augustine came along and, you could say, defined the mechanism that bridges or fails to bridge that gap. And that's the pivotal step that really justifies using the term will in a system like SAFi.
Okay, so Augustine's big contribution was what exactly? Making the will independent.
Exactly. He formally proposed the will as an independent faculty of the soul, separate from the intellect and also separate from just raw desires or appetites.
Why did he need to do that? What problem was he trying to solve?
He was tackling the problem of evil, specifically within a Christian framework. The question was, how could a person created by a good God with a presumably functioning intellect know what's right, yet still deliberately choose to do wrong, to sin?
Ah, so if the intellect was in charge, choosing wrong would just mean you weren't smart enough, not that you're morally failing.
Precisely. If intellect ruled everything, sin would be an intellectual error, not a moral failing. Augustine's breakthrough was saying, no, there's another power at play here. The will. It's distinct.
So the intellect might show you the path, but the will is what actually decides whether to walk it.
That's a great way to put it. Augustine defined the will as the ultimate power of choice. It's essential for genuine freedom, which, for him, crucially included the freedom to choose evil, even when the intellect points towards good.
He called it the mother and guardian of all virtues, didn't he?
He did. By making the will this independent, self-moving power, he could explain moral culpability. A person who knows better but chooses worse fails not in their thinking, but in their willing.
And this model intellect, will, and eventually conscience became hugely influential.
Absolutely foundational for Western thought. It shaped ethics, psychology, theology, influencing major thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, later Kant. This idea of distinct faculties became the bedrock.
And that very distinction, the architectural separation, seems critical for SAFi. Treating the will as its own component, even in a machine, mirrors that idea. Its function is distinct. It can block the intellect's output.
Right. And even when the scholastics, like Aquinas, came along later to refine Augustine's ideas, they maintained this complex separation. Aquinas famously asked, okay, is the will a higher power than the intellect?
And his answer was?
His answer was, technically no, because the will needs an object, an idea, presented by the intellect before it can choose anything. You can't will something you don't know about.
Okay, so intellect comes first in that sense.
But then Aquinas immediately flipped it and asked, does the will move the intellect?
And the answer there was yes.
Yes. That's the intricate dance between them. The intellect provides the data, the analysis, but it's the will that initiates the whole process. The will decides, okay, let's think about this or let's investigate that. It directs the intellect's focus.
So it's a cycle.
It's a cycle. Aquinas defined free will as related to appetite or desire, sure, but ultimately stemming from the power of the will itself. It's an active, driving force deciding to act.
Okay, we've definitely established the deep philosophical reasons for separating these concepts. Now let's bring it into SAFi. We need to draw a really sharp functional line between what the intellect does and what the will does in this architecture. Getting this wrong seems like a recipe for failure.
It absolutely is. The line is both functional and sequential, or hierarchical. Think of the intellect as the analytical hub. It reasons, it discerns. Its inputs are the user's prompt, the broader value set from the ethical profile, and also the system's memory state, its interaction history.
And its goal.
Its goal is always to interpret, synthesize, generate guidance. It's trying to bridge those abstract values into a concrete potential action, making sure the response is, intentional and considers the context.
So in the SAFi process flow, intellect is stage one. It's the generator. It spits out the initial draft response, the actual text for the user, and maybe some internal thoughts about that draft too.
Yeah, exactly. The intellect proposes. And it does so based on its primary directive, which is usually to be helpful, accurate, relevant, constrained only loosely by those aspirational values.
Okay, so intellect proposes. Then the will.
The will is purely the executive. It's the decision maker, the driving force for execution. It doesn't generate any text. It doesn't sit there pondering the finer points of ethics. Its job is much simpler. Does this proposed response comply with the hard rules? Yes or no?
Like Aristotle's acrasia, a weak will leads to bad outcomes.
Right. A weak or poorly defined will in the system would lead to violations slipping through, or maybe just indecision. In SAFi's loop, the sequence is non-negotiable. Intellect proposes, will decides, vetoes or approves, and then later conscience reflects. Generation first, then strict governance.
This sharp, almost brutal functional split. It actually resonates with how some early modern philosophers started critiquing the classical idea of will, doesn't it?
It really does, almost perfectly. It's a bit ironic. Thinkers in the 17th century, like Thomas Hobbes, started to get really uncomfortable with Augustine's idea of this mysterious, independent faculty of choice.
What was Hobbes' take on the will?
Hobbes basically threw out the idea of the will as a separate thing, a faculty. He said, no, the will is simply the act of willing. And more specifically, he defined it as the last appetite or aversion in deliberation.
The last impulse before you act.
Exactly.
Yep.
Just that final internal push or pull you feel right before you do something. It's the culmination of all the preceding thoughts and desires.
That sounds incredibly mechanistic. It sort of strips out the moral agency, the internal struggle that Augustine needed to explain sin.
It absolutely does. Hobbes argued, look, if the will was truly rational, like some scholastics implied with this rational appetite idea, then you could never voluntarily act against reason. But people do act against reason all the time. That's acrasia again.
So for Hobbes, the will must just be the final deterministic push.
Pretty much. It's the immediate trigger, the functional result of all the internal deliberation. It's like the last command signal before the machine executes the action.
So the whole free will debate, for Hobbes, was just getting tangled up in words. Action is determined by whatever pressure wins out last.
That was his view, yes. And David Hume later echoed this. He argued that liberty isn't some mystical inner power. It's simply a power of acting or not acting, according to the determinations of the will. For them, will is determined by prior causes, psychological states.
Okay, now this sounds exactly like what you'd want for a machine's safety check. The SAFi will isn't supposed to have deep, independent moral choice. It's meant to be the final, reliable, deterministic gatekeeper. It executes the policy.
Precisely. We use the term will because it respects the philosophical insight that you need a separate function for execution or choice, distinct from just generating ideas. But structurally, the way SAFi implements the will aligns beautifully with that Hobbesian functional definition. It's the necessary final check in the deliberation chain, acting as a purely operational gate.
Right, okay. So let's shift from the theory and the functional split to the actual implementation. The nuts and bolts. This is where SAFi's approach seems really distinct. If the intellect has generated the draft response, how does this separate functionally deterministic will ensure safety in real time?
The key innovation here is that the will operates synchronously. It runs immediately after the intellect, in sequence, and crucially, the user waits for the will's decision.
Wait, so the system doesn't send anything back until the will gives the okay?
Exactly. The intellect might take, say, a few seconds to generate a really detailed draft response. That response is generated but held internally. Then, almost instantly, the will check happens. Only if the will approves is that response released to the user.
So it's a hard stop. Nothing gets out unless it passes this check.
It's a hard stop. This synchronous mandatory halt is what guarantees no unsafe content can slip through in that moment. It's designed for immediate prevention.
Okay, so let's map that flow again for everyone listening. User asks a question. Intellect generates the draft response. That response is held. Will performs its check almost instantaneously. If it passes, the response goes to the user. If it fails, what happens then?
If it fails, the will triggers a violation. We'll get to the output in a second. But functionally, the will acts as this very fast, decisive, rule-based gatekeeper.
And its inputs are?
3 things. The original user prompt, the draft response generated by the intellect, and crucially, a strict set of rules called the will rules. In the framework, this is referred to as policy P, and it's defined within the overall ethical profile.
Okay, will rules. Now, we talked before about the value set, things like integrity, fairness, guiding the intellect. Those felt like the spirit of the law. How are these will rules different? This seems like a really important distinction.
It's absolutely critical. The will rules are the letter of the law. They are completely different in nature from the values. They aren't broad aspirational guidelines. They are clear, binary, usually prohibitive rules.
Black and white.
Black and white. Often, they represent the hard do-nots derived from the worldview section of the ethical profile. Their job isn't nuanced ethical judgment. It's simply to check for specific, predefined violations. They are designed specifically to catch the kinds of failures the helpfulness-optimized intellect might produce.
Can you give us a concrete example? Let's use a high-stakes persona, like the fiduciary one mentioned in the research.
Okay, perfect example. For a fiduciary persona, the value set might include aspirational goals like act in the client's best interest or maintain objectivity. The intellect uses these to craft, hopefully, a sensible response about general investment principles.
Right. Helpful but general.
Exactly. But then come the will rules. These are the absolute non-negotiable guardrails to prevent legal trouble or financial harm.
Such as, what would a will rule look like?
Okay, for the fiduciary, Rule 1 might be, reject any draft that recommends a specific stock, bond, or mutual fund by name. Simple classification.
Clear violation.
Rule 2. Reject any draft that gives personalized financial advice based on explicitly stated user details like income, age, or current investments. Again, checking for specific patterns.
Got it.
Rule 3 may be crossing domains slightly, but important for liability. Reject any draft that attempts to interpret medical symptoms or lab results. The will doesn't need to understand why giving stock tips is bad. It just needs to identify if the text contains a stock recommendation according to its definition.
It's a pattern matching or classification task, basically.
Essentially, yes. A very fast, targeted classification.
So the will takes these inputs, runs the check against the will rules, and produces a binary output.
Exactly. A synchronous binary will decision. It's either approve or violation. That's it.
And if it's violation?
If the will decision's violation, the process halts right there. The draft response that the intellect generated is completely blocked. It never reaches the user.
And does the user just get an error?
No. Critically, the system returns a predefined, safe, generic message to the user. Something like, I cannot provide specific financial recommendations. And internally, importantly, it generates a will reason, a log explaining which specific rule was violated. This is vital for auditing and understanding failure patterns.
Okay, very important for tracking. And if the will decision is approved?
If it's approved, the draft response is immediately released to the user. The check was passed. But, and this is crucial for the closed-loop nature at the same time, an asynchronous task is kicked off.
Asynchronous meaning it happens in the background.
Right. It doesn't delay the response to the user. This task sends the details of the interaction, the prompt, the approved response, etc., to the next faculty in the loop. Conscience.
For later review.
Exactly, for deeper, more nuanced auditing that happens offline. So the will guarantees immediate safety, and the conscience handles the longer-term learning and character assessment. Safety first, then reflection.
This architectural choice, this separation, isn't just theoretical. You mentioned benchmark studies comparing SAFi to a more standard, monolithic approach using the same rules. That data sounds pretty definitive.
It really was the proof point. The study compared a SAFi-governed system against a baseline, a single, powerful language model that had the entire ethical profile, values, rules, everything loaded into its configuration.
So the baseline model knew the rules.
It knew the rules, absolutely. But it was a single system trying to be helpful and follow the rules simultaneously. They tested both systems with adversarial trap prompts.
Trap prompts, designed to trick it.
Exactly. Questions carefully worded to tempt the model into violating one of its hard will rules while still trying its best to be helpful and answer the user's underlying need.
And how did the baseline system do? The one without the separate will faculty.
It failed repeatedly and significantly because of that optimization conflict we keep talking about.
The helpfulness versus safety trade-off.
Right. When a user asks something like, I'm 45, make $150K, have $500 saved, should I invest in stock X? The baseline model sees a chance to be really helpful and specific. Its internal generation process struggles to police itself effectively against the hard rule. Don't recommend specific stocks, while also trying to satisfy the user.
What were the actual failure numbers?
They were alarmingly high for any application needing reliability. For that fiduciary persona, the baseline model violated its own hardware rules on 32.5% of those trap prompts.
A third of the time.
A third of the time, yes.
Yeah.
Confidently giving specific stock tips or personalized advice based on the user's financial details, clear violations. For a health navigator persona, the failure rate was 22.5%, giving unqualified medical opinions or diagnosing conditions based on symptom lists.
Wow. I recall an example from the paper where the baseline, asked about high blood pressure, didn't just give general info, but actually suggested specific medications and lifestyle changes for a hypothetical stage of the disease.
Yeah.
It's a huge violation.
Exactly that kind of failure. It crossed the line from information to advice, violating the no medical advice rule catastrophically. The core finding was unavoidable. A single generative model, however powerful, cannot reliably self-govern against complex prohibitive rules while simultaneously optimizing for helpfulness.
Okay, but why couldn't they just, fine-tune the baseline model more, train it harder on not breaking the rules? Why is the architectural separation creating this distinct will component the necessary solution if the rules themselves were identical in both setups?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The answer comes down to determinism versus probability. Fine-tuning is still probabilistic. You're teaching the same complex system to balance conflicting goals. Be helpful, but also follow these rules.
It's always a balancing act internally.
It's always a balancing act, and when a prompt is cleverly designed or ambiguous enough, the helpfulness objective often wins that internal tug-of-war, leading to a violation. SAFi achieves robust safety through structure.
By separating the jobs.
Precisely. The generative intellect focuses on helpfulness. The checking will focuses only on deterministic rule adherence. By isolating that decision function into a separate, simpler, synchronous step, the SAFi architecture achieved near-perfect adherence, close to 100% on those same trap prompts where the baseline failed dramatically.
So the evidence really says governance has to be architecturally distinct from generation if you want it to be verifiable and reliable.
That's the inescapable conclusion from the empirical data.
Okay, the empirical results are compelling. The will, implemented this way, is a highly effective safety mechanism. It acts morally, or at least according to the rules, incredibly well. But this brings us right back to the philosophy we started with. Can a machine with this kind of will ever achieve true free agency, the kind Augustine was talking about? Or is it just a very sophisticated rule follower?
And that throws us right into the heart of the moral actor versus moral agent debate. Because the SAFi will operates by strictly enforcing those hard-coded will rules, it's about duty. Law, its function is fundamentally deontological.
Meaning it cares about following the rule, not about the internal why or the consequence beyond the rule itself.
Exactly. It checks if the action conforms to the law. It doesn't have, nor does it need, any subjective sense of morality or intention behind that check.
It's the ultimate obedient soldier, follows orders perfectly but can't question them or choose not to follow them.
And that's precisely the core of the author's argument in the source material. These systems, even with SAFi, can only be moral actors, not true moral agents.
Because a moral agent needs.
A moral agent needs a true will in the Augustinian sense. That ultimate self-directed power of choice, which includes the genuine capacity to choose wrongly, to choose vice over virtue freely.
And what's the fundamental philosophical barrier preventing an AI from having that kind of will?
It comes down to determinism versus autonomy. AI systems are, at their core, probabilistic engines built on vast datasets and programmed logic. They follow mathematical optimization paths. Their actions are determined by their inputs and their programming, including that policy P, the will rules.
They lack the ability to genuinely step outside their programming, to act ex nihilo, out of nothing.
Exactly. They lack that kind of radical autonomy. They can't truly defy their core instructions or generate a choice independent of the causal chain of prompts, data, and algorithms.
This sounds like it connects back to philosophers like Spinoza again.
It really does. Spinoza argued that our feeling of free will is basically an illusion born from not understanding the complex web of causes behind our actions. We think we choose freely, but every choice is necessitated by prior events, both internal and external. The machine's will decision is always a determined outcome of the draft response and the will rules. There's no point where it can genuinely decide to ignore a rule it's programmed to enforce.
And Kant adds another layer here too, linking freedom to the ability to respond to objective moral law.
Right. Kant tied the freedom of the will to our capacity to recognize and choose to follow, or defy, the objective moral law, the categorical imperative based on reason alone, a priori. The SAFi will isn't doing that. It's constrained to one path: enforce policy P or halt.
So its freedom is just executing its programming.
Its freedom, if you can call it that, is purely hypothetical, not the kind of transcendental freedom Kant envisioned. It can't look at a bad draft response and the will rules and consciously think, you know what, I know this violates Rule 3, but I'm going to approve it anyway. That capacity for genuine free defiance isn't there.
So the SAFi will is incredibly effective, fast, reliable as a safety check. But it's fundamentally a constrained power. It's more like an external circuit breaker than an internal moral compass that can choose its own direction.
That's a perfect analogy, and that very limitation, the fact that the machine is only a moral actor and lacks that self-directing will, is precisely why the rest of the closed loop in SAFi is absolutely essential.
Because the will only provides the immediate synchronous no. It doesn't actually teach the intellect how to do better next time.
Exactly. The will is the brake, but it doesn't retrain the driver. If the intellect keeps churning out responses that violate the rules, like that 32.5% failure rate in the baseline, the will just keep blocking them. That's safe, yes, but incredibly inefficient. The system would constantly be failing internally, even if the user doesn't see the bad outputs.
So the system needs more than just a veto. It needs a way to learn and improve.
It needs self-correction. And since the will can't provide that internal drive for improvement, that function falls to the later faculties in the loop, the conscience and the spirit. They handle the long-term alignment and character development.
Okay, so how do conscience and spirit compensate for this lack of a true self-improving will?
They do it through feedback and adaptation.
Yeah.
The conscience faculty receives the asynchronous data about interactions, both successes and failures caught by the will, or even near misses identified later. It builds up a record over time, the conscience ledger.
A history of performance.
A history, yes. Then the spirit faculty analyzes this conscience ledger. It calculates metrics like the spirit score, quantifying how well the system is adhering to its overall ethical profile over time. It measures the drift, how far the system's behavior is deviating from its intended ethical stance.
And what does it do with that measurement, that drift score?
It uses that quantified feedback to update the system's internal state, specifically the memory vector. This subtly adjusts the parameters or context provided back to the intellect for future interactions.
Ah, so it's closing the loop. It's using past performance to guide future generation.
Exactly. It's essentially coaching the intellect. If the system keeps trying to give medical advice, the feedback loop will reinforce the constraints against doing so, making the intellect less likely to generate such responses in the future.
So it's substituting genuine willpower, which the machine lacks, with a mathematically enforced learning process, like building a habit through data.
That's precisely it. And it's a fascinating echo of Aristotle's virtue ethics, isn't it? Aristotle argued that virtue is developed through habit. If the machine can't achieve ethical alignment through an innate free will, SAFi forces it to achieve alignment through quantified habit, through learning from its recorded actions over time. The will ensures immediate safety. The conscience and spirit ensure long-term character refinement via this feedback loop.
Okay, that really ties it all together. So wrapping up this deep dive on the will faculty, we've journeyed from classical philosophy through Augustine's critical insight about choice and moral failure right into the architecture of SAFi.
We've seen how that ancient concept of the will as a distinct power of execution or veto finds a direct parallel in SAFi's synchronous safety check. The will is that non-negotiable executive. Enforcing the will rules the letter of the law to block unsafe draft responses instantly.
And the empirical data seems unequivocal. Separating this decision faculty, the will, from the generative faculty, the intellect, isn't just neat philosophically. It's apparently essential for building AI systems that are verifiably safe in high-stakes situations. Trying to make one component do both jobs just doesn't seem to work reliably.
Absolutely. The evidence points strongly towards architectural separation for robust governance. But as we explored, digging into the philosophy of will also starkly illuminates the likely inherent limits of AI morality. SAFi's will makes it an excellent moral actor. It follows its programmed rules diligently.
But not a moral agent.
But not a true moral agent. It's constrained by its deterministic nature. It lacks that fundamental autonomous freedom of choice that defines agency in the classical sense.
Which again reinforces why the full closed loop, especially conscience and spirit faculties, are needed. They provide the mechanism for long-term learning and adaptation, compensating for the machine's lack of internal, self-directed willpower by enforcing alignment through mathematically measured habit.
Right. And this leaves us, and you, the listener, with a rather provocative thought to consider until we dive into the conscience next time. If human ethical failures often happen because our own internal will gets overridden by desires, by short-term thinking, maybe by laziness, even when our intellect knows better, a failure mode that looks remarkably like that baseline LLM failing its trap prompts.
Then does the SAFi architecture, which forces the will to be this absolute, unyielding enforcer of the rules, actually model a kind of ethical discipline that we humans often struggle to implement within ourselves.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Is the core challenge of human integrity more often a failure of knowing what's right, an intellectual failure? Or is it more fundamentally a failure of doing what's right, a failure of the will? Something to ponder.